Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I'm a bit of a sucker for slim gaming laptops as they're the only real class of system that provides decent performance and decent portability. Especially since the release of Nvidia's Max-Q series, we can now harness the power of GTX 1080s in chassis under 20mm thick, albeit with a bit of a downclock to keep everything in check. I've been waiting a little while to get my hands on the slim gaming laptops I'm looking at today, so they perhaps aren't the freshest releases of the year, but to make up for it, Acer pulled out all the stops and sent out two Predator Triton 700s, one with the GTX 1060 inside and another with the GTX 1080 Max-Q for us to take a look at. And a big shout out to PC Case Gear for helping hook us up with these as well. Check them out if you're an Aussie in the market for a gaming laptop. So a bit of background before I get into my thoughts on the Triton 700. If you want a GTX 1080 Max-Q laptop, there are only a couple of options on the market. The Asus ROG Zephyrus, which I checked out on the channel last year, as well as the Aorus X5 MD, which you can't buy now for whatever reason, and of course the Acer Predator Triton 700. And it turns out the Asus ROG Zephyrus is a very unreliable machine. According to user reviews on both Amazon and Newegg, a significant chunk of buyers have been experiencing problems, defects, and even dead machines. I quite like the Zephyrus when I checked it out, but with these sort of reports out in the wild, it's hard to recommend even if it's a few $100s cheaper than the Triton 700 in North America. And just on the pricing, the Triton 700 versus ROG Zephyrus is one of the weird cases where one model is cheaper in North America while the other is cheaper for us locally. In Australia, it's the Triton 700 that is $400 cheaper with an eye-watering price tag of $4,300 for the 1080 Max-Q variant. In America, you can expect to pay $3,000, so this laptop sits right at the top of the chain. Luckily, those that want this sort of chassis at a more affordable price can grab the GTX 1060 variant for $2,000 US or 2,700 Aussie. This is about twice the price of the cheapest and chunkiest GTX 1060 laptops, but extreme portability has always come at a higher price, as laptops like, the Razer Blade are also priced around this mark. Keep the MSI G63VR and Gigabyte Aero 15 in mind for cheaper options too. So before you all jump into the comments to discuss how expensive the Triton 700 is, yes, it is expensive and there are cheaper laptops with similar specs, but slim and light builds have always commanded that hefty price tag. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the GTX 1080 Max-Q. On a couple of other laptop reviews, I've seen comments suggesting Max-Q is nothing more than Nvidia crippling GPUs like with their previous M-series parts, such as, the GTX 980M. However, while the 1080 Max-Q doesn't hit the same levels of performance as the standard 1080, it's definitely not in the same class as the 980M. For starters, the GTX 1080 Max-Q is the exact same GPU as the GTX 1080 in larger laptops or desktops. It has the exact same CUDA core count of 2560, which incidentally matches the desktop 1082. It has the exact same 8GB of GDDR5X memory at 10,000 MHz. Where the difference lies is in power and clock speed management. Fully fledged GTX 1080s and laptops are equipped with beefy coolers, allowing them to be driven at their maximum clocks and at the maximum TDP, delivering top performance equivalent to the desktop GPU. Max-Q GPUs are designed for slimmer laptops with less capable coolers, so rather than melting the laptops in an attempt to cool the GPU, the driver lowers the power target and less aggressively boosts the clock speed. Think of it this way, if you had a standard GTX 1080, went into an overclocking utility and lowered the power target, you've essentially created the GTX 1080 Max-Q. Nvidia did tweak a few other things and optimized the power delivery hardware, but the basic story is it's the same GPU, just with a lower power target. And this is the perfect excuse to look at the performance of the Triton 700 in both its GTX 1060 and GTX 1080 Max-Q variants. Both systems pack an Intel Core i7 7700HQ CPU, which is the go-to standard for gaming laptops, along with 512GB SSDs, although the 1080 model's SSD is a super fast 256GB RAID 0 array. There's also 16GB of RAM to go with the 1060, and if you get the 1080 model, you get 32GB of RAM. I'm going to completely skip the CPU testing as we already know how the i7 7700 HQ performs and there were no surprises with either Triton 700 model. Instead, let's hop right into the gaming results and see how these laptops stack up. In GTA 5, the 1080 Max-Q model delivers excellent performance with the 1% low result above 60 FPS at 1080p ultra detail settings. The 1060 model also performs well here, delivering a playable experience without stuttering at these settings. Neither laptop pulls any surprises either, falling exactly where I expected for the hardware inside, considering some of the past systems I've looked at. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, it's much the same story. Nothing is a huge surprise. At the maximum detail level possible, only the 1080 Max-Q model delivered above a 30 FPS 1% low. Tuning down to high settings with the 1060 does deliver a good experience in this title though. In Deus Ex Mankind Divided with the Ultra preset at 1080p, the 1080 Max-Q delivers fantastic results once again, while the 1060 is better suited to the high preset here. It's interesting to note that the 1080 Max-Q isn't that far ahead of the GTX 1070, outperforming it by just 11%, though that's a similar story across most of the tests. Hitman is an interesting result because the Triton 700 with the 1080 Max-Q doesn't reach the same average performance as the Zephyrus, but it is outperforming it on 1% lows. Both systems are quite capable in this game using the DirectX 12 mode with ultra details. I like to keep testing with Watch Dogs 2 because it's so punishing on both the CPU and GPU. Most laptops struggle in this game with the Ultra preset, although the GTX 1080 Max-Q Triton 700 does a respectable job of keeping the 1% low frame rate above 30. The GTX 1060 model, on the other hand, performs well for a laptop with this GPU but could do with a few setting reductions. Not going to spend a lot of time discussing Mass Effect Andromeda as it's both a mediocre game and runs well on most laptop hardware. The GTX 1080 Max-Q model pushes well above 60 FPS on average, while the 1060 variant still delivers a decent experience here. Nothing out of the ordinary for either of these GPUs. In Prey, the GTX 1080 Max-Q model exceeded my expectations here and actually outperforms the Zephyrus by a fair margin. I would say a recent driver update has given this title a nice boost compared to some of the laptops I tested earlier. Middle-earth Shadow of War benefits from the GTX 1080 Max-Q's extra power, allowing a 1% low result of above 50 FPS using the Ultra preset, while the GTX 1060 is stuck pushing just over a 30 FPS 1% low. With that said, the game runs really well on the high preset too without sacrificing much visual quality. So as I've mentioned a few times, both GPUs perform pretty much exactly as I expected in the Triton 700. The GTX 1080 Max-Q model is typically around 45% faster than the GTX 1060 model when looking at the all-important 1% low results. When comparing the Triton 700s to other similar laptops with this hardware inside, the GTX 1080 Max-Q model is basically identical in performance to the ROG Zephyrus on average. There's a bit more variance among the GTX 1060 models in some games, but again, on average, you're getting roughly the same experience from the Triton 700 as other GTX 1060 laptops. A couple of other interesting things to note about these laptops. The 1080 Max-Q variant uses a blazing fast 256GB RAID 0 array, which produces outstanding sequential performance and decent random speeds. The GTX 1060 model, though, isn't as impressive compared to other 1060 gaming laptops that include much faster single SSDs. Considering the premium price point of the 1060 variant, this sort of performance is a little disappointing. It's also a bit disappointing to see the 1080 Max-Q model getting a superior display. Both are 15.6-inch 1080p IPS LCDs, but it's only the 1080 Max-Q that gets a 120Hz refresh rate and G-Sync. Again, considering the price of these laptops, I'd have liked to see the same display in both models. Sure, the 1080 Max-Q is more likely to use the higher refresh rate, but premium laptops should include the best hardware possible. The interesting thing about both Triton 700 models is they both use the same cooling solution. In the case of the GTX 1080 Max-Q, the cooler has to handle somewhere around 100 watts of GPU power, while the GTX 1060, it's only having to cool about 65 watts or so. This should give a thermal and noise advantage to the GTX 1060 model during gaming. And looking at these results, it does, at least in regards to the thermals. While playing Watch Dogs 2, the CPU and GPU both sat at 6 degrees Celsius cooler after 30 minutes, while noise levels were at the same 42 dBA from 50 centimeters away. Neither system is particularly loud. There is a slight high-pitched twinge to the cooler, but it can be easily drowned out with game audio. The GTX 1060 does have a bit more headroom for either overclocking or running at a quieter level, while the GTX 1080 Max-Q model runs close to the limits of this thermal solution. As for design, both Triton 700 models are identical, and like the Zephyrus, this is a design that has the keyboard along the front edge, which is a bit unconventional, but it allows the upper area to be used entirely for cooling. It does mean the trackpad is relocated to an odd glass area above the keyboard, which is one of the weirdest trackpad placements I've seen. The trackpad itself performs well, but the position is too awkward for all but the most occasional use. You'll definitely need to use an external mouse with this laptop for the best results. Continuing the list of unusual aspects of the Triton 700, the keyboard uses very clicky keycaps. I think they're trying to imitate the feel of a mechanical keyboard with a loud click, but it doesn't quite work and ends up just feeling like the click is masking the usual rubber dome mush. It's not a bad keyboard, though it perhaps doesn't live up to the billing as a true mechanical keyboard. As for the general build quality, Acer has done a fantastic job here using a combination of metal and plastic that feels neither cheap nor over the top with game elements. The competing Asus Zephyrus uses a nice design too, but I wasn't as sold on the separating base panel or Asus's more gamery aesthetic. In this regard, I like what Acer has done with the Triton 700 a lot more, save for the keyboard and trackpad oddities. The Triton 700 is also reasonably portable at just 19mm thick and 2.4 kilos heavy. It's not as light as the Razer Blade, the Zephyrus, or the MSI GS63 VR, but I would take a bit of extra heft for the superior build quality and, especially compared to the Razer Blade, better cooling capacity. All the standard I/O is on this machine, including gigabit Ethernet, full HDMI and DisplayPort, Thunderbolt 3 and multiple audio jacks. This is identical on both models, and I especially like the inclusion of DisplayPort, so you can easily attach external monitors and get the full benefits of features like G-Sync. So at the end of the day, the reason why I wanted to look at the Triton 700 is that I'm searching for the ultimate portable gaming laptop. Machines like the MSI GS63 VR, Gigabyte Aero 15 and Razer Blade either have loud coolers or top out at just GTX 1070 Max-Qs. The Asus Zephyrus, as I mentioned earlier in this review, has reliability problems and suffers from a few strange design choices. The Acer Predator Triton 700 with the GTX 1080 Max-Q is the closest to perfection I've seen. You get excellent performance, typically 40 to 60% ahead of the GTX 1060 and 20 to 35% faster than the GTX 1070 Max-Q, both of which are more commonly used in this sort of form factor. The screen is exactly what you want with this hardware, providing 120Hz refresh and G-Sync. The build quality is fantastic as well, with a decent selection of I/O, and the included RAID 0 SSD is blazing fast. But it's not perfect. Achieving better build quality has led to a heavier system than its competitors. The trackpad is in a very strange and impractical location. The keyboard is marketed as mechanical, but it doesn't live up to that description, and the cooler is basically right on its limits. On top of all of this, at nearly $3,000 US, it's also a very expensive proposition for most buyers. I think we may see some of these issues addressed in second-gen Max-Q laptops, though if you want to jump in right now and get the best performing portable gaming laptop on the market, it's the Predator Triton 700 with 1080 Max-Q you should be looking at, especially considering the competition. The GTX 1060 model is a harder sell at its $2,000 price point. There's nothing inherently wrong with the gaming performance, thermals or builds, but the MSI GS63 VR offers a similar package for less money, less weight, and with a faster SSD. The Gigabyte Aero 15 should also be in consideration with its slim bezel design, calibrated display, and again, lower price. But a huge shout out once again to PC Casey for hooking us up with these laptops. Check them out if you're thinking of grabbing a gaming laptop. They have loads of models on offer. Also consider supporting us on Patreon for exclusive behind the scenes videos, and I'll catch you in the next one.